There is a particular kind of gratitude that feels exactly like a debt of its own, and Cora Linden was learning that lesson in front of half the county at once. Reverend Colby stood at the front of Marlow's small stone church, hands folded, telling the congregation what a fine, generous thing Mr. Wade Ellison had done for the Linden family. Colonel Ezra Thorne, seated in the second pew with his gold watch chain catching the light, called it the most Christian act Marlow had seen since the war began. Cora sat with her spine straight and her gloved hands folded over a hymnal she wasn't reading, while 30 faces turned, one by one, to look at her with something between pity and approval. They thanked him. Nobody thought to ask her how it felt to be the reason he was thanked.
It wasn't charity.
He said it quietly to no one in particular, and no one in particular believed him. 6 days earlier, the bank in Millbrook had held the note on Linden Hollow. Her father's debts accumulated over 2 bad harvests and a war that had taken both his mules and, eventually, him. Wade Ellison had walked in and bought that note before the ink dried on the foreclosure notice. The county called it generosity. Cora Linden, riding home from church with her mother's hand tight around her wrist, called it something else entirely, though she hadn't yet found the word for it. Linden Hollow, what remained of it, sat 2 miles outside town on land that had grown cotton for 30 years and grief for the last 3. Augustine Linden had died the way so many men did that year, not on a battlefield but weeks after leaving one, of a fever the field surgeons called camp sickness, and everyone else simply called the war catching up with him late. He came home to Marlow in a box his neighbors carried, and left behind a ledger that made considerably less sense than his absence did. Louisa Linden set the tea down harder than she needed to, and told Cora she would write him a note of thanks, and that she would mean it.
I will write him a note. I make no promises about the meaning.
Her younger brother Robert, 14 and full of the particular fury of boys too young for the war and too old to be spared its consequences, said what Cora had been thinking since the sermon ended, that everyone in that church had looked at them like something he'd found on the road. Louisa didn't argue the point. She only reminded them both that the alternative, the bank, the auction block for the land, the family split between whichever relations would take them, had been 3 days from becoming real. Cora knew the arithmetic as well as her mother did. She had done it herself at this same table, by candlelight, more nights than she could count, knowing the arithmetic didn't make the debt feel like anything other than a leash. She had met Wade Ellison exactly 4 times in her life. Once at a county dance before the war, when he'd been too shy to ask her for a second one. Twice at his father's mill, buying rope. Once at his mother's funeral where he'd said 9 words to her, and she'd remembered every one. None of those 4 times explained why a man would hand over $1,100 for a family he barely knew.
I intend to find out what he actually wants for it.
Perhaps he wanted nothing, Louisa said. Perhaps some men were simply decent.
Mother, I have not met one yet who was decent for free.
She said it harder than she meant to, and regretted it exactly as much as she meant it. To understand what the county was thanking him for, you have to go back 6 days, to a bank in Millbrook where the decision took less time to make than it took to walk through the door. Mr. Aldous Dunmore, the bank's manager, had the Linden foreclosure papers already laid out on his desk when Wade Ellison came through in his work coat, cotton dust still on his boots. Dunmore said this wasn't mill business. Wade said he'd like to buy the Linden note anyway, before the week was out. Dunmore mentioned carefully that Colonel Thorne had inquired about that very note not 2 hours before, and expected papers by Friday.
Then I'd like mine ready by this afternoon.
The door opened before Dunmore could answer, and Colonel Thorne came through it like a man who expected to be the only one in the room who mattered. He said he hadn't taken Ellison for a man who read foreclosure notices.
I read the ones that concern people I know.
Thorne said he barely knew the Lindens.
I know enough. I know what a family looks like the week before it loses everything, and I'd rather spend $1,100 than watch it happen twice.
Thorne's eyes moved over him, weighing a comment he chose for once, not to make aloud, though when he spoke again it was careful enough. Debts, he said, had a way of attaching themselves to whoever paid them. Ellison might find himself owning more than a piece of paper.
I've already done the arithmetic, Colonel. I'll manage what it costs me.
He signed the note before Thorne's own offer had finished being spoken, and rode back to the mill $20 poorer than he'd planned. Unable, if anyone had asked him that afternoon, to explain why it felt less like a transaction and more like something owed to a dead man he had never gotten the chance to apologize to. The storm came in fast off the ridge 2 evenings later, the kind that turned the Millbrook Road to soup and dropped the temperature 10 degrees before supper. Cora rode out anyway. She told her mother she was checking the fence line. She was not checking the fence line. Ellison Mill sat where the creek narrowed into a ford, and by the time she reached it, the water had come up brown and fast over the crossing stones. Her horse balked at the edge, spooked by a branch tumbling past in the current, and reared hard enough to throw her forward against the reins. The animal's back legs slid on the wet stone. For one long second, horse and rider tipped toward water, moving faster than either of them could swim. A hand closed on the bridle before she went in. Wade Ellison had come out from the mill office at the sound of the horse, soaked through in the time it took him to cross the yard, and he held the animal steady with a grip that didn't shake even as the current pulled at his boots.
Get down now. This side, not that one.
She got down. Her knees weren't entirely steady when they hit solid ground, and neither, if she was honest, was her voice.
I came to ask you a question, not to be rescued.
You can still ask it. You'll ask it from here, where the ground stays put.
Rain ran off the brim of his hat and down a face that gave away nothing, the same careful blankness she remembered from his mother's funeral. It was the face of a man who had learned, somewhere between here and the war, not to let his expression cost him anything.
Why did you buy my father's note?
Would you believe me if I said it wasn't your business?
No.
Something in his jaw moved, close to a smile that didn't arrive.
Then I won't waste breath saying it.
He didn't answer the real question. He walked her horse the long way around the flooded crossing instead, one hand on the bridle the whole way, and said nothing else until they reached the road where it was dry enough to part.
Ride home before dark finishes falling. We'll talk about the note when the creek isn't trying to kill you.
She rode home soaked, furious, and no closer to an answer than when she'd left, except for the fact that his hand closing on that bridle had felt like the first steady thing she'd touched in 3 years. If this story's already pulling you in, tell me what city you're listening from tonight. A like tells the platform to put it in front of more people who'd love it too. The morning after the ford, Cora rode into Marlow for flour and thread, and learned that gratitude, once it starts moving through a town, travels faster than any wagon. Mrs. Priscilla Hale, who had shared a hymnal with Cora every Sunday of their girlhood, found her at the ribbon counter and said, pitched exactly loud enough for the whole store to hear, that it must be such a relief not having to worry over money anymore, now that Mr. Ellison saw to everything. The clerk's wife added, without looking up from her ledger, that some families simply had luck follow them, the way trouble had followed the Lindens for years before it turned. Cora paid for her thread with hands that didn't shake, because she had learned, over 3 years of quiet suffering, exactly how to make her hands behave when the rest of her wanted to. She did not correct anyone. Correcting them would have meant explaining what she still didn't understand herself. That being saved and being owned had started, in the county's mouth, to sound like the same word. 2 days later, the same talk found its way to the feed store, where a stable hand named Gus Farley said, within Robert's hearing, that the Lindens ought to be grateful they still had a family name worth defending at all. Robert put him on the ground before anyone could stop it, 14 years old and swinging with everything 3 years of quiet fury had stored up. Farley was 20 and considerably larger, and had just gotten his feet back under him when a hand closed on his collar and hauled him back before the second swing landed.
That's enough. From both of you.
Farley opened his mouth to argue and closed it again when he saw whose hand was on his collar, since Ellison Mill paid half the wages at that end of town.
Robert, go on home. Your mother doesn't need to hear about this from anyone but you, and she'd rather hear it calm.
Robert went, knuckles split, jaw set, and considerably less alone in his anger than he'd felt walking in. Wade walked beside him as far as the mill turnoff and said the one thing that mattered.
Your father would have decked him twice as hard and you know it. Doesn't mean you were wrong to be angry. Means you'll need to learn where to spend it.
When Cora heard the story that evening, first haltingly from Robert and then more fully from a neighbor who'd seen the whole thing, she understood that Wade Ellison's debt to her family had started paying itself out in currencies that had nothing to do with money at all. There is a particular chemistry to hard, necessary work done beside someone you are still angry at. The anger and the labor have a way of blurring into each other faster than either one expects. The storm had torn out 40 feet of the low dam that fed both the mill race and, further down, the last working section of Linden Hollow's irrigation ditch. Wade sent word later that week that he'd have his men out repairing it by noon, since the water served both properties. Cora came anyway in her oldest dress and picked up a shovel before anyone could tell her not to. They worked through the afternoon without much talk, packing clay and fieldstone into the breach, hauling brush to slow the current while the patch set. Wade worked with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and a stiffness in his left leg that he never mentioned and never let slow him. Somewhere in the third hour, passing a stone between them, their hands met and neither one pulled back right away. It wasn't a conversation, it was the kind of understanding that doesn't need one. Colonel Ezra Thorne arrived on horseback before the light faded, uninvited, and looked at the mended dam the way a man looks at money he'd expected to collect. Ellison, he said, seemed to be playing banker now instead of miller.
I hear you're still upset the bank sold that note before you could buy it yourself?
Thorne's smile didn't move past his mouth. He held the note on the mill race easement. He reminded him in case Wade had forgotten. The county was laying rail through Marlow within the year, and that easement was worth considerably more than what Wade had paid for Miss Linden's little debt. He'd hate for old grudges to cost a man something he actually needed. He rode off without waiting for a reply, and Cora watched Wade's face for the first time since the Ford go from careful to something closer to afraid.
What easement?
Nothing you need to carry tonight.
I have been carrying my family's debts since I was 19 years old. I can carry one more sentence.
He didn't answer that either, but she noticed, walking home in the dusk, that he'd said carry like it was a familiar weight, like whatever Thorne held over him wasn't new. She asked him about the leg on that same walk, mostly because the silence between them had gotten comfortable enough to risk a question that might break it.
You never talk about the war. Robert says you were at Chickamauga.
Robert talks too much.
He kept walking a moment before he answered properly, the way a man does when he's deciding how much of a room to open.
September of last year. A ridge nobody remembers the name of now except the men who didn't walk off it.
He told her about the field surgeon who ran out of chloroform by noon. About a corporal named Dell, 19 years old, who'd asked Wade to write his mother before the surgeon even looked at the leg, because Dell already knew what the answer would be.
I wrote to her, told her he'd been brave. That part at least was true. She wrote back 6 weeks later and thanked me for it, and I have never once felt I deserved that thanks.
The same volley that took Dell's leg clean off caught Wade's own leg below the knee. Not clean, not enough to take it. Just enough to leave a stiffness that never fully left him and a limp he'd stopped explaining to people who hadn't earned the story.
Is that why you don't talk? Because you already know what the words are worth.
I talk plenty. I've just learned which words to spend on which people.
She understood, in that moment, that she had just been told she was one of the people worth spending them on, and that he would rather have shown her that than said it outright.
Get back inside!
They walked the rest of the way to Linden Hollow without needing to fill the quiet, and for the first time since the note had arrived, the silence between them didn't feel like debt at all. The fire started in the cotton store 2 nights later, and it started, everyone would later agree, from the north wall, the wall that faced Thornland. Robert smelled the smoke first and woke the house with a shout that carried across the yard to where Wade, checking the mended dam by lantern light, saw the glow before he heard the bell. By the time Cora reached the store, flame had already found the dry timber of the loft, and her mother's voice was somewhere behind her screaming that the last of the baled cotton, the only crop standing between the family and another winter of debt, was still inside. She went in anyway. Smoke took the air from the doorway before she'd crossed 3 steps, and the loft beam let go somewhere above her with a sound like a gunshot.
Cora!
He came through the smoke half-bent, one arm already wrapped over his mouth, and found her on the floor where the fallen beam had knocked her down. Coughing, still reaching for a bale she had no chance of lifting alone. He didn't argue with her. He got an arm under hers, hauled her up bodily, and half-carried, half-dragged her back through a doorway that was burning at both edges by the time they cleared it. They went down together in the yard, both of them coughing, both of them alive, while the roof of the cotton store folded in behind them with a sound the whole county would hear in the morning. Robert and 2 of the mill hands got the worst of the fire contained before it reached the house. Half the cotton was lost, enough to matter. Not enough to finish what the note had already started saving. Louisa stood in the yard in her nightclothes with a lantern shaking in her hand, counting her children by lantern light the way she'd once counted them by daylight, before the war had made counting necessary.
You didn't have to come in after me.
You didn't have to go in at all.
He said it rough, his hand still fisted in the back of her scorched dress like he hadn't quite decided to let go, and for one unguarded second the careful blankness was entirely gone from his face.
I have already lost more than I intend to lose again. You're not going to be one more name I say too late.
If you have ever had someone say the truest thing they know in the middle of the worst night of your week, you understand why Cora Linden didn't ask him what he meant. Not yet. She simply let him hold on. He came by the next morning with a jar of burned salve his mother had taught him to make before the war, and stayed exactly long enough to be sure Cora's hands were healing, and not 1 minute longer, which told her something about restraint that words wouldn't have. Robert, still smelling faintly of smoke himself, sat on the porch step cleaning soot from a bridle and pretended not to watch the 2 of them standing too close together near the well. Louisa brought coffee out without being asked and found an excuse to need Robert's help inside almost immediately. Wade worked the salve into the burn along Cora's palm with a care that had nothing hurried in it, the same unshaking steadiness he'd shown at the ford, except this time there was no current pulling either of them anywhere.
You're better at this than a miller ought to be.
Field hospitals teach a man things he never asked to learn.
It was the closest he had come in days to mentioning the war without being asked, and Cora understood it for the offering it was. Not an answer, but a door left open a few more inches than before.
Thank you for the salve, for the fire.
You'd have done the same for me.
I would have. That's rather the trouble, isn't it?
He didn't ask her to explain what she meant. He simply nodded, with the quiet certainty of someone who already understood exactly the trouble she was talking about, and left before the quiet between them could turn into something neither of them was ready to name yet. The truth came from her mother 3 days later, and not from him at all, which was its own kind of answer. Louisa found the old survey letter going through her late husband's papers, tucked behind a Bible neither of them had opened since the funeral. It was dated 11 years back, signed by Josiah Ellison, Wade's father, and it laid out in a lawyer's careful hand how the Ellison Mill's water rights had been quietly expanded onto Linden land through a boundary survey that Josiah Ellison had paid to have falsified. It was the beginning of everything: the lost acreage, the thinner harvests, the debts that piled year on year until a war finished what a crooked survey had started. Cora's father had known, Louisa said quietly. He had never told a soul, not even her, not until the very end. He'd said shame had a way of keeping its own counsel. The letter didn't explain itself the way a memory would have, so let me show you what it was describing. 11 years back, on a boundary line that ran through what was then simply cotton land, Josiah Ellison walked the survey with Augustin Linden and a hired surveyor named Purdy, the 3 of them checking stakes against a county map neither Linden nor Purdy had thought to question. Josiah told him the line ran there, same as it had run since his grandfather's time. Augustin said Purdy's stakes sat 10 yards further into his east field than he remembered them. Memory, Josiah told him, was an unreliable surveyor. Trust the paper, old friend. Augustin Linden trusted the paper. He had no reason not to. Josiah Ellison had sat across from him at church suppers for 20 years, had stood godfather to a child who hadn't lived past infancy, had shaken his hand on 100 smaller matters without once being wrong. What Augustin Linden didn't see was the second map, the one Purdy kept folded in his coat, the one that matched Josiah's coin more than it matched the actual ground. 10 yards here, 6 there. Enough over enough seasons to move the mill race squarely onto Ellison land and take the best watered acres of Linden Hollow with it. Josiah Ellison never told his son. He carried the falsified survey to his grave the same way Augustin Linden carried his suspicion quietly, and at considerable cost to everyone who came after them. Wade found the real map, the one Purdy had kept for himself out of some flicker of conscience and sold to the Ellison estate lawyer for $30 after Josiah's funeral, folded inside a ledger no one had opened in a decade. He had spent 3 years since trying to decide what a son owes for a father's theft, when the father is dead, and the money is mostly gone, and the only people left to pay are the two families still living on either side of a boundary that was never honest to begin with. That is what the letter in Cora's coat actually meant. Not charity, not romance. A debt older than either of them finally coming due. Cora rode to the mill with the letter in her coat, and something colder than anger settled behind her ribs. The particular cold of understanding you've been grateful to the wrong person for the wrong reason.
You knew. Every dollar of that note, every kind word after church, you knew exactly whose fault it was that we needed saving at all.
I found that survey in my father's desk the week he died. I have spent 3 years trying to make it right, the only way I could without dragging his name and yours through a courtroom the whole county would feed on for a decade.
You let me believe it was kindness.
It was kindness. It was also guilt. I never once told you it was only one of those.
She had wanted for a moment to hear that it had all been love from the very start, something simpler, something that didn't taste like restitution. What she got instead was the truth unpolished, and it cost him visibly to give it to her.
I need to think, alone if you don't mind.
He did mind. He didn't say so. He stepped back from the mill door and let her go, and that, more than anything he might have said instead, told her something true about the kind of man he actually was. She found him 3 days later at the small linden plot behind the church, kneeling at her father's headstone with his hat off and a fresh bunch of late-season chrysanthemums already wilting slightly from the ride. He hadn't heard her approach. For a moment she simply watched him, a man on his knees in the cold, saying something to a grave that wasn't his to visit, that he had no obligation left to visit now that the debt was paid, and the county had already decided who the hero was.
I come most weeks, have since I found the survey. He deserved better than a son who only found out what my father did after there was no one left to make it right to.
You never told me you came here.
It wasn't for you to know. It was for him.
She sat down in the frost-hardened grass beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all.
He would have liked you. Before any of this, he liked men who did their arithmetic honestly.
I'm not sure I've done anything honestly since the day I bought that note.
You told me the truth when it would have been easier not to. That's honest enough for most people I've known.
It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. Not entirely. But it was the first ground either of them had stood on since the mill door that didn't feel like it might give way underneath them. Colonel Thorne moved fast once he understood the survey letter existed, because a falsified boundary meant his own claim to the mill race easement was worth considerably less than he'd told the railroad company it was. He called an emergency session at the county land office 3 days later, ostensibly to settle the easement dispute, and half of Marlow crowded in to watch, because in a town this size, a land dispute between the Ellisons and the Lindens was the best entertainment available since the war began. Thorne stood before the county registrar with his own surveyor's map and argued, smooth as ever, that Wade's note purchase on the Linden debt was itself improper. A conflict of interest, given the old boundary dispute, and ought to be voided. The land returned to auction, where he stood ready to bid. Cora had not planned to speak. She stood at the back of the room with the 11-year-old letter still folded in her coat, listening to a man who had helped falsify her family's ruin, now arguing that the man trying to undo it should be punished for it. Wade slipped in through the side door as Thorne finished, and did not try to speak for her. He simply came to stand at her shoulder, close enough that Thorne's eyes flicked between them and understood, a half-second before anyone else in the room did, that he had already lost it.
I have a document the registrar should see before this vote is taken.
She walked the length of the room herself, past 30 pairs of eyes that had watched her, one Sunday, be pitied. She was not asking to be pitied now. She laid the survey letter on the registrar's desk and read the relevant lines aloud herself, her voice steady even where her hands were not. Josiah Ellison's payment, the falsified boundary, the true line the land had held for 30 years before it was moved. The room went the particular kind of quiet that means everyone has just understood something at the same moment. Thorne said it proved nothing about the current dispute, and even if it did, he said, Ellison had bought that note knowing full well what his father did. That made him no better than the man who'd wronged her in the first place.
It makes me a man trying to finish what my father should have started himself. I never claimed to be better, Colonel, only honest, which is more than this county's had from you in some time.
It proves the mill race easement you're so eager to defend was built on land that was never rightfully separated from Linden Hollow to begin with. Take that to the railroad company, Colonel, and see what they pay for it now.
The registrar, a careful man who had survived 4 years of war by never taking sides too quickly, asked for the letter to be filed and the vote postponed pending review, which was everyone in that room understood, the sound of Colonel Thorne's leverage quietly ending. Thorne left without another word, his boots loud on the floorboards in a way they hadn't been on the way in, and the room he left behind did something Cora hadn't expected. It turned slowly to look at her not as a woman who'd been rescued, but as one who had just done the rescuing herself. Cora Linden stood in a county land office having just done, in 5 minutes, more to settle her family's fortunes than 3 years of silence had managed. Outside, Louisa was already waiting on the courthouse steps, having refused to come in and watch, and when Cora told her what had happened, her mother sat down hard on the stone step and laughed with the sudden release of someone who'd been braced too long for something that never came. Wade found her afterward on the church steps, where she'd gone to sit in air that didn't smell like smoke or paper or old men's ambitions.
You didn't need me for that.
No? I didn't.
She said it plainly, without cruelty, and watched him absorb it slowly, the kind of truth that costs a little more than a man lets show on his face.
I needed you for the ford. I needed you for the fire. I did not need you for Thorne, and knowing that is worth more to me than the note ever was.
If you've ever loved someone more easily once you no longer needed them to save you, you know exactly the quiet that settled between them on those church steps, not distance, but its opposite, room enough for something to grow that debt could never have grown.
I owe you an apology I don't know how to make small enough to fit in a sentence.
Then don't make it small. My father kept a secret for 11 years because he thought shame was safer than the truth. I would rather have the truth even burned around the edges than another kindness with something hidden underneath it.
He took her hand there on the steps, in front of whoever cared to look, which by now was considerably fewer people than a week before, because the county had already moved on to a newer story.
Then here's a truth with nothing hidden under it. I have been in love with you since a dance you probably don't remember. Before either of us had anything left to lose, the note was guilt. This isn't.
I remember the dance. You stepped on my hem twice and never asked for a second one.
I am asking now, not as payment, not as apology, as a man who would still be asking if the note had never existed at all.
She said yes, the way people say yes to the thing they've already decided, quietly, without ceremony, on a set of stone steps outside a church that had spent one Sunday calling him a hero and calling her nothing at all. Louisa and Robert had come out onto the steps somewhere during all of this, close enough to see everything and far enough to pretend they hadn't. And Robert, for the first time since his father's funeral, was grinning like a boy who still had reason to. The county would go on calling it whatever suited their sermons. Cora Linden had stopped needing them to get it right. There is a particular kind of gratitude that feels exactly like a debt of its own, and there is another kind entirely, the kind that costs nothing to receive because it was never meant as payment at all. Cora Linden had spent 3 years unable to tell the two apart. She would spend the rest of her life quite certain of the difference. If there is a debt in your own life you have been carrying so long, you've forgotten it was ever meant to be paid off rather than lived inside of, I'd like to know what finally set it down. Tell me in the comments below. Sometimes the telling is its own kind of settling.